Hey, I'm Jordan Cooper, aka Blender Ed, Blender HD, from Rotogrinders to show you how exactly I won $116 plus $1,000 in MMA DFS for the UFC 265 card. And you can see here my winning lineup. This was the optimal, a very low scoring slate. 13 fights on the card, only 6 went to stoppage, and you couldn't even get all 6 of them in. You could see here that if you played the slate, the 4 highest owned fighters did not make the winning lineup. I mean, let me tell you, when the chalk fails, typically I'm doing quite well. This is a good tutorial also on a game theory driven approach to playing MMA DFS or DFS in general, and showing you exactly how you could utilize something as simple as the betting lines and ownership percentages to build plus EV lineups, which this one happened to be. So we got Penny, 10% owned, one of the lowest owned fighters, the second lowest owned with a first round submission. You have Cop, who is one of the lowest owned, like 9K range fighters, with a first round knockout. Then Melissa Gatto, who won by TKO in the second round with a whole bunch of scoring. And then just enough points. Luque finished first round submission, I believe, yes. And then Yadong and Morales won and scored enough on the slate. No main event fighter in the winning lineup, and it was duplicated 2 other times, which is fine with me. I try to go for as much of a solo win as possible. That's where the whole equity, those ties for 80-weight ties, when you're splitting that much, you're just not going to win often enough. So one of my goals is to make as many lineups as possible that are under 5 dupes. Now, I want it to be unique if possible, but to be more likely, I don't mind, especially with 200K to first. Hey, if it's duped 3 times, that's still $116,000. That's still plus EV. I'll still take it. Now, how exactly did I build these lineups? Okay. Now, to make a couple of things clear, your goal in DFS, especially for these large field contests, this is very large. This is how many? Where? 35,294 entries, right? And pretty much all the equity is getting that optimal lineup, that nut lineup, the best possible lineup. So your goal is always to aim for that as unique as possible. But the main thing in DFS is that you need to put yourself in the position to get those opportunities. So it's not just a matter of who do I think is going to win a fight. Who do you think is going to be low owned, that could win, that could put up a lot of points? Your goal is to build plus EV lineups. Did I like Penny in the fight? Probably not. She had a low chance of getting that first round submission. Did I particularly like Luque at his price and his ownership at 33%? No. But he could still make plus EV lineups. So it's not about the individual fighters. And I'll show you along the way. It's about figuring out how much leverage do you need plus win probability, the equity in the contest, that gives you, if we played this over 10,000 times, 100,000 times, what was going to be most profitable, and building those types of lineups. So some lineups, may have one of those chalky pieces, those 4 chalk pieces that didn't end up in here. I still had plenty of them. I still had lineups that had those fighters in it. And I had less of fighters that weren't necessarily the best EV plays, but they could still make up a plus EV lineup. The main thing about this lineup, you'll see when I go through, I didn't have that much of Penny. I didn't have that much of Yadong. I didn't have that much of Luque. But I was way over on Cop and Gatto, and based on their ownership, they were 2 of the highest EV plays on the entire slate. So I don't mind as long as I get something out of them and it all fits together. You could build a winning lineup. So going to what I have is, this is my cheat sheet. I don't want to call it a model. It's not really a model. Now, over at Rotogrinders, we do have projections, okay? Moneyball 16 and H3 Buddha and Sean PSU Fans, Eyes 819, I think Squirrel Patrol does MMA stuff. And they'll come up with like median projections, median and ceiling projections. And that's based on a lot of the fighting metrics, such as, strikes landed and takedowns defended and all those types of things. So obviously, we have certain fighters who fight in a style where they're more likely to get more points in a win than other fighters. Like we have someone like Michael Chiesa, who's a big grappler. And grappling is good for ceiling when it comes to DraftKings scoring because of the takedowns and the control time and the ground and pound significant strikes on top. And guys like Jose Aldo, like who really never get to the ground or anything, kind of a slower paced technical striker, like his projection is going to be pretty low. Like it's very hard for him to score 100 points without a first round finish. Okay, so obviously his median is going to be lower. Now, if you're basing your lineups based on these projections, you're not taking into account the most correlative metrics when it comes to ceiling scores. Your goal in large field GPPs should be to aim. Your aim is to get 90 to 100 points out of every single fighter in your lineup. Okay? Doesn't matter what the salary is, right? We've seen underdogs that put up 130 before, right? So it doesn't matter what the salary. There's no value metric of, well, for 7,600, I need X. Like, no, I'm aiming for 90 to 100 points I'm aiming for that. It doesn't mean I need it, obviously, on the lineup that I had. I only scored 571. But when the chalk fails and there's only 6 finishes and I have the highest scoring ones already, you're not going to need them. But the point here is that, like, I don't care about how they fight. Okay, I'm going to care in a second. I'll show you how I weigh this. So I don't want to call this a model. Like, this is a very, very rudimentary model, but it's not modeling the fights. It's basically modeling the ownership versus the most correlative metrics. Okay? So it's all based around what I believe the field is going to do. This is a game theory driven approach. The most correlative metrics to 90 to 100 point scores, number one, by far, is round 1 finish. Okay? It's the R is 1 for 90 points. Because obviously, if you win in the first round, you get 90 points, right? And there's no way to get negative points, as far as I believe. So if your fighter gets a first round finish, they're guaranteed at least 90 points. Not guaranteed 100, depending on what they did in the first round, if there's a knockdown or anything. But the R, the correlation of a first round finish to a 100 point score, is the highest that there is, no matter how they fight. Doesn't matter if they did it via wrestling, via submission, via knockout. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if they're a striker, they're a grappler, they're a wrestler, they're jiu-jitsu. It doesn't matter. Okay? The next most correlative metric would be winning inside the distance. Okay? Now, obviously, winning inside the distance in the second round, you get 70 points. Winning inside the distance in the third round, you get 45 points, plus whatever you scored. Okay? It's not guaranteed that if someone wins inside the distance, they get 90 plus points, but it's the most correlative, more so correlative than number of takedowns, number of strikes, any of those fight-related metrics, those much lower, right? You can't really gauge if they're going to score 100 points, 90 points, based just on that. Yet, if you made a graph and you plotted it out of the inside the distance odds and the round 1 finish odds to all the fighters that have ever scored 90 points on a DFS slate, the R would be extremely high. Extremely high. The third most is win odds. And that's significantly less. Significantly less. Okay? Because you could win a fight via decision and score 60 points. Right? Now, the contrapositive is true. Like, it's almost impossible. And I guess there have been a few rare times that a loser has put up 100 plus points. Maybe in some main event 5-round fights, maybe. maybe, possibly, but almost every 100-point score is the winning fighter. Okay, so that the R of that, the correlation of that is nearly 1. But just because you win doesn't mean you score 100 points. So the opposite isn't true. So, like, these win odds, like, I don't care that much about them. Okay, they're going to be weighted in a little, but I care more about the win odds when the slate is small. Okay, this was a 13-fight slate. If this was a 10-fight slate, now, if there aren't that many finishes on the slate, then a winning fighter with 70 points may be optimal, maybe fine, maybe perfectly fine. The more fighters there are on the card, the more opportunities there are for people to be finishing in the first, second round, scoring 90 or 100 points. So just simply winning a fight, right? If I get a Vince Morales win for 70 points, which I did, and it turns out that it ended up making the optimal, but it's much less likely. I don't necessarily care about the minus 107. I don't care about the minus 103 here, the minus 105. A lot of people in MMA DFS gravitate towards what we call line value fighters, meaning that DraftKings pricing would come out on Monday or Tuesday, and the fight would be, kind of minus 120 to minus the 100, like the $8,400 to $7,800 range. And then by the end of the week, the line is like completely shifted to the other side, where the guy priced as an underdog, the fighter priced as an underdog, is now the favorite. So you're technically getting the fighter more likely to win for cheaper, and the fighter that is less likely to win is more expensive. People tend to gravitate towards that. Now, in smaller field contests, okay, the win equity, that may be fine. You're not aiming for the nuts in a small field contest. But in a large field at 35,000 entries, you're aiming for the nuts. I don't care if the fighter wins. He needs to win and get 100 points. He needs to get 90 points. I'm aiming for that. Doesn't mean I'll need it, but I'm aiming for that. So this win probability, I don't care that much about. So what I do is I have a spreadsheet, and I put in the money line odds, the inside the distance odds, and the round 1 odds. And I convert them to a percentage, right? Because that's what the American odds to, the actual implied probability. And these are VIG odds. So you technically should take out the VIG, the 10% or so that the sportsbook takes. But it's all relative. I don't necessarily care about the exact number. I just care about them relatively to the fighters relatively to one another. It's not necessarily the difference between these numbers is going to be kind of the same. Just they'll be slightly lower, right? But they'll all be lower at about equal amounts. Now I get the odds primarily from offshore books. You just because you're looking at them relatively, you could go to DraftKings Sportsbook, you could go to FanDuel Sportsbook, or any of the legal United States books and use those odds. Those are perfectly fine. But typically, the VIG on those are 20 cents, 25 cents. So it's not as reflective. And also, the United States books have more of a propensity to limit sharp betting, yet some of the offshore books don't. So I'm looking for the sharpest line possible because I don't care about the actual line. I'm not betting on any of these fights. I just need a more accurate probability. And this whole game theory approach is built upon the efficient market hypothesis, where I'm going under the assumption that the lines are accurate, that they're sharp, that they're efficient, right? Now, if you know UFC, you know that sometimes, the public bets on certain sides, and these lines could be beaten, right? If you're a UFC, if you're an MMA bettor, right? Some of these lines are suspect. But as someone that doesn't know UFC, like I'm not going to be able to long-term be able to determine that. So I'm just going to go purely based on the wisdom of crowds, that the sports betting lines are reasonably enough efficient that I should take them at face value. That the efficient market hypothesis is true. All the information is out there and it's all built into the lines. Okay? So I use this. Now the goal is that because inside the distance and round 1 probability are so correlative to 90 plus point scores, essentially I'm going to be using a very rudimentary expected value equation of just dividing these numbers by the projected ownership. So if we see here, we see these numbers, these red and green numbers over here that says lev, that stands for leverage. So I want to know the multiplier of all of these odds against what the projected ownership is. So we could see here with someone like Manel Kopp. 140 plus 140 inside the distance, which is 42%. Round one finish plus 300, which is 25%. Projected, 23% owned. So he has a 42% chance of finishing inside the distance, but it'll only be 23% owned. That makes him plus EV. He's going to be less owned than his chances of finishing inside the distance, which is correlated to a 90-plus point score. And then we could take a look here. Someone like Cyril Gahn, 50% inside the distance, but he's going to be 52% owned, right? 33% inside the distance, 28% owned. We look at a chalky fighter on the slate, Pedro Munoz, who is fighting Jose Aldo. 30% owned, but only a 24% chance of winning inside the distance. Only a 14% chance of winning in round one. So based on just these odds, that fighter is over-owned. Okay? Angela Hill, 14% inside the distance. 8% round one. 20% owned. Over-owned. So that's why you see the red. Round one, you see, it's all based on a scale of where one is kind of in the middle. So the more green, that means they're less owned than they should be. They're under-owned. Red means they're over-owned. Now, how do I find the ownership? Now, here at Rotogrinders, we have projected ownership. So I do plug that in. But remember, when I'm using a game theory approach, very driven in what my opponents are doing, remember, I'm not trying to predict the fights at all. I'm assuming the odds are reasonably accurate. Here you go. Here are the probabilities. Now, where's the inefficiencies? So if I'm using a game theory approach and I'm looking for what my opponents are going to do, I'd also like to know what they're looking at, right? And while I would highly suggest that if you want MMA content or DFS content in general, that you sign up for Rotogrinders, not everyone does, right? Some people, a lot of people, they subscribe to other sites. Now, there's also a lot of people sitting on their couch just, not looking at any of this. And those are the Joe Schmoes. And if they win, so be it. But I don't know what they're going to do. But if you're looking at other places for content, well, that means they're looking at a place and they're using that information to build their lineups. So I want to know what that is. So I look at two other sites and what they project as ownership, and I average that out. Just so there's no outlier. In case, we may be off, RG may be off, these other two sites may be off by a little bit, it'll kind of average itself out, right? So like Luque, we had it 34% owned, projected. He ended up coming in at 34, but two other sites had him much lower, right? One site had him at 24%. So RG was more accurate for that fighter, but maybe less accurate in another fighter, right? If we take a look here for actual, let's see, like Chiesa, because I remember looking at it. Rotogrinders, we had him at 24% owned, and I knew he was going to be like 35 plus. I knew it, right? Because he scores so well and wins, and he was talked about on so many shows, and it makes sense from a projection standpoint, not from an inside the distance or round one finish perspective, but just from the fact that he wrestles. So even in a decision, he could probably score a lot of points. But we had him at 24%. He came in at what? 37% owned, right? If I just went by the 24% here, he would have came out as a much better rated fighter in my model than if I just averaged them all out and just got 30%, right? He rated out poorly even at 30%. He ended up being 37%, right? So he's even worse there. So that's what I'm doing. Taking these odds, comparing it to ownership, and seeing where the market is inefficient. Now, like I mentioned, that doesn't take into account the actual scoring, right? Because we have two 5-round fighters. Now, in 5-round fights, you get 2 extra rounds to score points. So we've seen quite often that a fighter could easily get 100 plus points in a 5-round decision win. But if I just use these odds, it wouldn't account for that. So that's the reason why I do still put in the median projection of the fighter. Because obviously the fighters that either have 2 more rounds to work with or fight in a style where they're more likely to score more points, like they're gonna project higher. So I want to still factor that in because I'll be blind without it. The main event fighters will look even worse than they should be. So putting in those projections, and I do the same thing with the projections. I want to know what my opponents are looking at. Okay? So I'm going to those 2 other sites, looking at what their projections are, and then averaging that out. Okay? Just to make up for any type of outlier we could see here. I mean, the scales are a little bit different. Like we see here, Carolina Kovacevic, we had at 62 median. Another site had him down at 54. Right? So just so you get a nice swat. Like Leonardo, we had at 54, while other sites had her at 60 plus. So because other people are looking at these 2 sites, in addition to Rotogrinders, I want it in here. Okay? So now I take a weight of all of these numbers. So I want to take a weight of the win leverage, the inside the distance leverage, the round 1 leverage, and the projection against the ownership. Weigh them, like obviously on a large card, the weight for winning is going to be much lower. And the larger the card, the weight for round 1 is going to be much higher, right? If it was, let's say it was a 15-fight card and there's 9 finishes on it, like getting 6 and 4 of them in round 1, like you're probably going to need all 4 round 1 finishes. To win the large field GPP. So I need to weight that higher on larger cards. On a smaller card, like a 10-fight card, hell, there may only be 2 first-round finishes. You get 2 of those, and 4 winning fighters by decision, you could win a large field GPP. So I weight the win higher. So I do that all, and I come up with a rating, right? Kind of a rudimentary EV type of calculation. So based on all of that, it could show me which fighters are plus EV and which fighters are minus EV in a vacuum just to themselves. But you still have to build 6. You have to build a lineup with 6 fighters, and it doesn't mean that you can't play a fighter that is red. That Angela Hill rated out as the worst play on the slate. Like we take a look here. We had Kopp at the number 1 play, Munoz at number 2, based on the projected ownership. Kopp is number 1, Munoz is number 2, Menefield is number 3, and then we kind of get Johns and Gatto. Whoever wins the Rodriguez-Morales fight, that was underowned. Then we get like the underdogs of Menefield and Munoz. So Simmons and Herman were way underowned for their chances of, like Jamie Simmons as one of the lowest inside the distance odds. 16% chance. 9% chance of a first round finish. Only projected to be 7% owned. So it's still above. 9% chance of putting up a really big score. Only 7% owned. The lowest owned fighter on the entire slate. So yes, the standard deviation is going to be high. This is not going to happen that often. But when it does, it's most likely going to be in the optimal winning lineup in large field GPPs. So that's what it's based on. It's not trying to predict the fights. All it's doing is trying to gauge where the ownership is inefficient based on these metrics. And the more under-owned the fighter is, such as Kopp, the more leverage you get in your lineup. So your goal is to build a 6-fighter card lineup that has enough leverage to win a large field GPP. So if I have Kopp and Munoz in a lineup up here, like I could still have Angela Hill in that lineup. It's not the best lineup with Munoz and Kopp, but it's not the worst lineup, right? If I was going to build a lineup with, let's say, Gon, Aldo, Kenny, Chiesa, Anderson Dos Santos, and Menefield or something like that, like that rating score, the sum of all of that would be much lower than me playing Kopp, Johns, Munoz, and Angela Hill, right? Yeah, Angela Hill may be minus EV in a vacuum, but in that lineup as a whole is still better than the one that I just mentioned. So that's what I'm using this rating for. So I take these ratings and I actually put them into Lineup HQ. Like I put the actual number in as if it's the projection. And the reason I do this is because now I don't care about ownership anymore. Like, I don't care about the sum of the ownership. I don't put any ownership in here because it's already reflected in this number. Kopp, based on these numbers, Kopp, Munoz, Simmons, Herman, Morales, Rodriguez, I'm going to get, if I just had 100 max, right, 100% exposure max, I'd get them in 100% of my lineups, right? Do I want that little diversity? No. But that's what will end up happening based on these numbers. But that's good because these are the ones that provide the most leverage. So I'm putting them in so I don't have to worry about the ownership. I already know that my lineups are the higher this number is, the more leveraged the lineup is. So I can optimize based on just that number. Now, I entered 160 lineups. I know now you're going to say, oh, but you can cover all your bases. You can't. There's way. We're talking about tens of thousands of combinations, even on a 13-fight card, okay? But your also goal is to be unique. And because I'm using this rating to build my lineups, I have to be less concerned about being duplicated because obviously I'm playing lineups that are way under-owned as they should be. Now, I used to have a process where I could factor in duplication, but to me it's redundant now. I think this is a better way than what I was doing it before. And trying to play lineups that were just not duplicated, but they were also worse lineups. So I think I have more of a shot at getting more unique lineups, or at least within like only duped 5 times. This way, rather than the old way where I would build lineups with like an ownership sum and then prune. Like I'd build 200 and then prune 40 that had two common combinations in it. And I'd use groups or whatever. I don't have to do that anymore because I believe it's factored enough into this number. So now from a diversification standpoint, in 160 lineups, I'm going to start telling you how lucky I actually got, okay? But remember, the whole goal is to put yourself in the position to get lucky, okay? So I played 160 lineups. But I only played 94 into the $25 into this contest because I played the 20 max. I played that there was a $5 5K to first. I put 20 lineups into that. There was an $8 5K to first. I put 20 lineups into that. There was a second contest that came around. It was a $20 contest with 20K to first. I put 10 lineups into that. And because I like to reduce my variance, I'm less risk tolerant, right? I'd rather be smooth than take big chances. Like I play all unique lineups, so I don't build 150 lineups, and then I put the top 20 into this, and I duplicate myself, right? So I don't have the same lineup in every contest like that. I have all uniques, and it's primarily random, okay? So the 94 lineups, it was 90 lineups that I built, and I had 4 single-entry 3-max lineups that I also throw into this type of contest, right? Those are the just-in-case type of things, right? Just in case my 555 lineup would have also won this, like, it's $25 just for the peace of mind. So I built 90 in the optimizer for this, plus 70 for other contests. And then the 160, I just cut and paste randomly into my Excel spreadsheet, okay? So it's quite possible that this lineup could have ended up in the $8 contest and only won $5,000. Would have been the nut lineup, right? Just so happens I got lucky that when I pasted it in, this happened to be in the $25 contest. Another lucky thing is that based on all the lineups that I produced, the lineup that won was the 159th lineup. Okay? It was the 159th lineup. If I go by like Luke right here, right? If I find the lineup, it should say lineup 159. Where is it? It's probably all the way at the bottom. 160, 149, 159, right here. Here's the lineup. There you go. 6.63. So it was one of the lowest lineups. 6.63. I got some 5.8s in here. 6.63. So if we take a look at where it shows up, fantasy points low to high. I got some 5s in here. So it wasn't even one of the top lineups. Anywhere close to one of the top lineups. But it just so happened I made its 159th lineup and it got in. Hey, that happens, right? You got to put yourself in the position to get opportunities. Okay. So I go into Lineup HQ, and like I said before, if I just let this run with no constraints, with no nothing, like I'm just going to get all the Simmons and Herman and Munoz and Menafield and Kopp and God. I'm just like, all the lineups are going to look the same. And I'm relying, obviously I'm not going to get Simmons and Munoz in the same lineup, but I'm going to get 50% Simmons, 50% Munoz, and if that fight busts, all my lineups are dead, right? I like to be more diverse than that. I may be over, I may have a lot of those types of lineups, but I don't want to X out fighters, because even Kowalkiewicz could make some plus EV lineups, not as many, right? So I want to give myself a good chance of having the opportunity of getting the optimal lineup, okay? And then I also don't want so many of my lineups to be like, look, this 5 same fighters and 1 change, 5 same fighters and 1 change, 5 same fighters and 1 change. So I have like 10 lineups that pretty much look the same except for 1 fighter, right? That's not as diverse. You could do that. It just means that your swings are going to be way bigger. If you're really high on certain fighters and you want to have them in 80% of your lineups, that's more. You could do it. Just understand that when you're wrong, you're going to lose a lot, and when you're right, you're going to win a lot. If you don't mind those big swings, I'd rather be a little bit more diverse. So I set my number of unique players to 2. So at least there has to be 2 different players in all 160 lineups. Is at least a 2v2. Okay? So I do that, and then since I know that Simmons and Herman are going to be so low owned, right? I have them projected at 11 and 7. Like how much of these guys do I need? Right? They're the highest EV underdogs on the slate. And I'm also the Munoz and Menafield, who are fighting against them as the favorites. They're also 2 of the highest EV fighters on the slate. So it's like those 2 fights are kind of what I'm targeting. And how much of one do I want over the other? Well, I decided on 30%. Right? I said, just don't give me more than 30. Give me 30% Simmons, 30% Herman. And I also know that based on the fact that they're fighting Munoz and Menafield, and I have a bunch of them, I have a lot of lineups that would be Munoz and then the opponent of Menafield. Right? Munoz, Herman, and Menafield, Simmons will be a lot of lineups. A high-priced 9K fighter with a low-priced 7K fighter, the opposite of the other fighter. And I also know that Munoz and Menafield are both going to be high-owned. Right? We have Menafield projected at 40, Munoz at 34. They ended up coming in at 46 and 47, which means you get so much more relative value by playing those underdogs. Now the underdogs didn't win, right? But they're not expected to win. They're just, when they do win, they're going to be in the optimal lineup, most likely, because they're so under-owned. So I want to play as many of those lineups as I can, within reason. So 60% of my lineups had Simmons or Herman in it, okay? Now, then I look at the top of here, and I see that the main event rates out pretty poorly, right? Based on the projection, even in 5 rounds, based on, if you knew the fighters, you knew that Lewis does not throw volume at all, right? And Gane is very patient. So this fight could go 5 rounds, and even if Lewis wins in a decision, he may not even score 50 points, right? Gane may not even score 70 points, right? But it shows in the rating. So I knew that I was probably going to be way under on the main event, and typically the main event gets overowned as it is. So I projected Gane at 52, Lewis at 19. It came in Gane at 46, and Lewis at 26. If I knew he was 26% owned, I may have had only 4 or 5 Lewis lineups. So I look at the top end and I go, okay, who is the most underowned? Well, Kopp, right here. Munoz. I also have Gatto in here. If you go across, Gatto, Johns. Fiziev is okay. Fiziev is in that range. but kind of like this. So if I don't have Gone in the lineup, I kind of want a mix of these in here. And we have Gato at 22%. I expected her to come in even less than that. She came in at 18. So I was leaning more towards Gatto. So I was going to build Gatto, Cop, Munoz, Menafield, and you can see right here, based on the exposures, right? I typically don't have more than 50, 55% of a fighter on a 13-fight card. I want to be diverse. So I ended up with the most. Here you go. I used the sheet exactly the way it is. Give me Cop, give me Munoz, give me Menafield, give me Gatto. 40+% on all of these. And then I look at that Draco Rodriguez Morales fight on this sheet, based on the rating. That's what I want. 1.4, 1.02 in comparison to the other fighters in the range. So give me the winner of that. Okay, so give me all of that. Then I also look at, I'm playing a bunch of Gatto. Leonardo, 0.87 isn't great, but it's still, in comparison to fighters in a range like Munoz, Hill, Chiesa, Osborne, right? Anderson Dos Santos is okay, right? So you have Leonardo and Dos Santos. We're okay based on these ratings. Where Leonardo and Dos Santos, right here, 30%, right? Just along with exactly what was on my sheet. Miles Johns, I got 30% here. Herman, right? And then I have 26% Gone, right? I still gave myself some, but way under what it is, because he still rates out. You know, Gone and Fiziev are up here. So I go here, I give myself some Gone and Fiziev. And now I just have to fill it. Now I'm just filling out the rest. Now I want to go to the bottom. Go, who's the worst plays on the slate? Well, Carolina Kovacevic, 0.75, right? Ode Osborne, Pedro Munoz, Angela Hill, right? I look at that, and I barely have them, right? I capped them. I capped all four of them at 6%, right? Lewis and Green, if I didn't take Lewis or Green, I would have had to had so much more Simmons and Herman just by price point, right? I have to have some. If I have 0 Green, 0 Lewis, that means I need underdogs to fit into my lineup, right? So I'm going to end up with more Simmons. If I wanted to do that, I could have, but I chose to. I'll have a little, right? Because they don't rate out well. Chiesa, not horrible, but not good. Like Luque over here was one between Torres, Aldo, and Luque. Actually, Luque rated out the worst. Torres rated out the best, and it turns out Torres actually put out the best score out of all three of them. So Torres, Aldo, and Luque. So Torres, 14%, which is over. Aldo, 16%, and Luque, 11%. And then that Yadong Kenny fight didn't rate out that well, but 12%, okay, a little. Same for Jessica Penne. I ended up with a little bit more because I didn't have much of Kovacevic. I didn't have much of that fight at all. Do you see how putting yourself in the position and getting lucky is a big factor of DFS? Look at this winning lineup. Penne, Yadong, Luque. Now, you saw before, I had a ton of Gatto. I had way too much of Cop. And I had, Morales, what was Morales owned? 20% owned, and I had 34% of him. Cop, I had 54% of. He ended up being 19% owned. I had 41% Gatto. She ended up being 18% owned. Now, Penne ended up being 10% owned. And Penne, Morales, and Yadong ended up being 25% owned. If you take a look at my exposures, Yadong, I only had 12% of my lineups. Luque, I only had 11% of my lineups. Penne, I only had 13% of my lineups. But they would obviously fit in lineups that take 3 of these players here, these fighters up here. So I didn't go out of my way to try to get Penne, Yadong, and Luque at all. Right? They weren't the worst rated fighters, but they weren't high rated in comparison to others. But since I play a little bit more diverse, I don't X out a fighter, I give myself a chance to build plus EV lineups. And the fact that I had so much leverage from having Cape, Cop, and Gatto in the lineup, and Morales in the lineup, it ended up giving me a lineup that ended up, being the top one in the top 160. Like that. Then what I do after the slate is I actually put in the actual ownership, right? Because this is only the projected ownership. And then I redo these calculations. I compare the actual ownership to these betting lines. So I could see, like, where I screwed up and where I did well. Right? We could see here that having a lot of cop was the best. I mean, you have to judge yourself by, would you have done the same thing had you have known? Had you have known the ownership? And I look at the actual ownership, and had I known that Munoz was going to be 47% owned rather than 34, I would have had less of him. Now he's still rated well, but not as well. He wasn't the second best rated fighter in this model as it was before. So based on this, I would have moved my Munoz ownership to who now Gatto, Johns, right? Because Johns came in under what he was projected. Gatto came in under what she was projected. Torres came in under what she was projected. And Aldo came in under what he was projected. So look at these numbers comparison to the ones above them. So most likely I would have had less Munoz, less Menafield, a little less Fiziev, about the same of Gane, but I had more Aldo Torres. And then we see the Draco Rodriguez Morales fight has actually ended up got better. So having 40%, 39 and 34, I would not have changed my decision. I look at this, I go, Chiesa, I didn't have much of. Based on the actual, he was even less of a good play. Munoz, same thing. Good choice on Munoz. Good choice on Hill, even though she came in a little bit under than she was projected, but still 0.77, not good. Having barely any Ode Osborne, great decision, right? Had I known he was going to be 28 rather than 21, I would have barely had him at all. Same for Derek Lewis, I had too much of, right? Because he was 19% owned and he ended up coming in 26. So I probably would have had a little bit less. I didn't have him in that much. But I still, Simmons and Herman, I wouldn't have changed anything I would have done. Anderson Dos Santos, I had 30%. I wouldn't have changed that based on actual 13% own. I would have taken that all day. The only thing that Penne became a better play, right? Look at this. She moved up to 1.49. She was originally 0.78. Right? So if this is what it would look like, if she wasn't going to be 19%, she was in 10% own. I ended up with what? 13% Penne? I would have ended up having more like 25%. She would have been more closer to what Anderson Dos Santos was and Leonardo was. Because if you take a look at Leonardo, like, not as good in comparison to Penne, right? I would have had Penne, I would have been 30% on, and Leonardo, I would have been 12% on, right? Now, I ended up getting that lineup, but yeah, had I known, I would have had way more Penne. This is not even based on the result. Remember, I'm just going on based on ownership. This is regardless of the result. The only thing that goes against that is Luque. Luque had at 29 projected ownership. He ended up being 34. So he became the worst play of all the favorites. So looking at I had very little of him. I had 11%. But had I known that, I probably would have only had 6%. And maybe that lineup with Luque wouldn't have gotten made. I wouldn't have that in it. So sometimes it takes a little bit of luck. But there you go. And then all the lineups should be leveraged enough, should be lower duplicated based on the numbers in my little quote model. But this is a game theory driven approach. Like I said, this is not projecting the fights. I'm not projecting who's going to win. I'm barely even considering what they're going to score based on how they fight. Just the inefficiencies between what the betting market says and what my opponents are doing. And then just building lineups based on that. And when I play a single entry contest, a lot of times I'm playing one of the top, leveraged lineups, right? I don't necessarily want to play Simmons and Herman in the same. I don't need to be that unique, right? To play Herman and Simmons against Menafield and Munoz in the single entry contests were like 55+% owned. Like, yeah, I could see playing one of them, but do you need both to win the 555? No. I won the 555 the week before with 2 losing fighters. I don't need to do that. So typically I'm taking some. I took one of the Herman lineups, right? I decided, do I play Menifeld? Do I play Munoz? And if I don't, whoever one I play, I'm going to play the opponent of the other side, right? That type of thing. Now, I didn't cash in the 555, but I did take $116,666 three-way tie for first place. I ended up with a total of 120,000. So even though the rest of my lineup still cash, but if you see here, if I just quick view and just look show only mine, my lineups came in first and then 568th, right? In this specific contest, right? And like the $5 contest, I think I came in fourth or something, right? So I made like $500, $600 in that, but just all you need is one. So I hope the lesson to take out of this, regardless, this has nothing to do with this card. You could do this for any slate, any MMA slate. You could do this for any sport, pretty much, right? That's very correlative to the betting market, right? Golf, I guess, right? There are sports that are more correlative to the betting market. You could do the same exact thing, but it's based not around predicting the outcomes. It's just where are the inefficiencies in the market, and then play and build these plus EV lineups every slate, every day, whenever you can, until you realize that expected value, that equity. Because you can see here, this is my MMA career. I've only played 28 slates. I only started playing MMA last year because of COVID, right? Because the sports didn't come back, and then we had MMA, and like that's the only thing. Soccer I was playing, and it's like, okay, there's nothing else going on. Golf was back a little, so I'm like, okay, I'll learn how to play this MMA stuff. But just like a GPP player, like you're gonna, unless you win first place, it's hard to be profitable in MMA in these large field GPPs. So your goal is to survive long enough, build plus EV lineups, and wait to realize your equity, right? So it's going to be a long slog, right? And I'm not even saying in the beginning I wasn't even that good. I wasn't even doing as much of this process. I was doing this process in concept, but I didn't build my own little spreadsheet here. So you can see here, just go down, 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 down. A little up there. There's a Bing, right? Here's that was a $2,500 Bing, right? Not as much as I needed, but still, little $2,500 uptick. Then down, lose a little, lose a little, lose a little, lose a little, lose a little. Then here's a $4,000 uptick. Then kind of like, not much, kind of breaking even. A little, there was like a $300. And here you go, here's $2,500. Here's a $1,500. This is my like 17,000 because I won the 555, and then there's 120,000, right? And then what it's going to look like after this is probably in the next 28 slates. It's probably going to look just like this, right? It's going to be, you go down here, it's going to be and then hopefully a big spike at some place. So if you're going to play like this, if you're going to have a very game theory driven, playing to the nuts type of approach, playing these large field GPPs, this is the road. This is any GPP player will tell you. This is what their graph is going to look like. It's going to be down, 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 up, down, 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 up. And these ups, you're looking for one of these a year. A year. Look, it makes my year. It makes my entire year. Right? If I play the rest of the year in MMA, I'm going to be up. So as long as if I could do this once a year, and hopefully it's for 116, maybe if it's for a 30, that's still profitable. So you could lose. Look how many losing slates this is. Out of 28 slates, I lost money on what? This looks like one winning, two, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And just I was on a heater, I guess, right, in the past couple of slates. So 20 out of the 28 slates I lost money in, right? Most likely by the end of the year, it'll be like, it'll be up to 50 slates. I'll still have 10 winnings and 40 losing. That's still good. That's still pretty good. 80% losing slates. That's why bankroll management is important. You're not playing. I'm not playing 10% of my bankroll, right? The volume that I play is 1 to 3% of my bankroll typically. So I could survive these. That's fine. And if you're not playing the large field, like the higher dollar, this was a $25 contest. Play the quarter arcade. Play the mini max. Play the $1, $3, the 20 max, the whatever, $4 contests. Like if that represents 1 to 3% of your bankroll, 5% of your bankroll, maybe, you could do the same thing, but your chart should look pretty much the same. If you're building lineups to win first, if you're not building lineups to win first, it's going to be less steep, but you're going to just bleed money the whole year. You're going to cash a lot more of your lineups, but by the end of the year, you'll be down like 10%, right? You'll be down 15%. Like that's the rake. So it may seem like, oh, I'm cashing lineups here. I'm playing 40 lineups and I cashed 30 of them. Like if you did that and cashed 30, and you're not going to cash enough. By the end of the year, you're going to be down. So it may seem like you're doing well. You may seem to be playing the plays, but your goal is to not play the plays. It's to play the player, right? That's what they say in poker. It's very similar to poker, right? I'm not playing my hand. I'm playing your hand. So I hope you got something out of this. You could apply this to any DFS sport. You can. You can pretty much MLB, NFL, NBA, anything. And that's why I have a course that does just that. The theory of daily fantasy sports. It's a 15-hour audio DFS masterclass at theoryofdfs.com. So all these concepts and how to think like a professional DFS player are in this 15-hour course. It's like a little structured guide for you. You can listen to it over and over again if you want. Applies to any sport. Includes game objectives, player selection, expected value, leverage, correlation, construction, risk management, exploits, and psychology. It doesn't have hard math. You don't have to do hard math, right? It doesn't mean that you have to make an Excel spreadsheet. As long as you understand the concepts, right? You didn't have to do this spreadsheet. You could have just said, is this guy over-owned or under-owned based on how I think he's going to do? How the probability. It's the probability of this player hitting a home run above or below their ownership, right? Is this player, in golf, is this player's top 10 percentage is X based on this betting line? He's going to be owned Y. Is that or above or below? It's the same exact concept. You're exploiting the inefficiency of your opponents, not, trying to make markets yourself. You're not trying to predict what's going to happen. You're not trying to project how many points a fighter or a baseball player or an NFL player are going to score. You just use these metrics to make probabilities and go, based on these probabilities, is it more or less worth playing this player in a lineup? And then you're playing 6 fighters, 6 golfers, 10 baseball players, 11 football players. And in the scope of fitting it in within, $50,000 or whatever in salary and the positional constraints or whatever, it doesn't mean you're going to get all 8 plus EV high projection type of lineups together. You may get 5 and then 3 may be minus EV plays, but the whole lineup as a whole is plus EV. So don't go into this going, oh, okay, Jordan, I'm going to use your model. I'm going to set up something just like this because it's not complicated, right? I just showed you what exactly I did. I don't even have to share this with you. You could recreate this exact same spreadsheet yourself. And then just play the green fighters and don't play and X out all the red and play all the green. Those would be the highest EV lineups, but that doesn't mean you're going to win on any specific day, right? It doesn't mean anything, right? And how big is your bankroll to survive that? So feel free to do that. Feel free to recreate this. Feel free to go to theoryofdfs.com. I hope you got something out of this for any sport, but especially such a binary sport like MMA. And that's pretty much, with a lot of luck, like you see. I'm perfectly fine admitting that it takes a lot of luck to win in DFS. But if you put yourself in the positions to get lucky more often than other people, it's going to pay off. So that's a mix of skill and luck on how I won $116,666.67 in MMA DFS for UFC 265.